Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and this week's contract tip has to do with the buyer's sale or lease contingency. So if you are working with a contract, whether you be on the buyer's side or the seller's side, and the parties go binding and the seller agrees to take a contract contingent upon the buyer having to sell or lease their existing home. So you have a buyer who lives in one home, has to sell or lease home A before they are able to close on the contract that they have for home B. So a couple of things about this exhibit. The GAR exhibit is GAR form F90, sale or lease of buyer's property contingency exhibit. And the RE form exhibit is RE251, sale or lease contingency exhibit. Imagine that creativity in those names. But anyway, so a couple of things I want to address with this contingency and what it means. First of all, basically it means that the seller agrees that the seller agrees to take the contract contingent upon the buyer's ability to sell their house or get a fully executed lease on their house by on or before such and such date. And there is a date that the buyer and the seller negotiate for this to occur. Now, if the buyer is not able to sell their existing property, home A, or lease it prior to that date that gets negotiated, at that point, then the contract will terminate. The seller agrees to basically stay in contract with this person and give them that time frame to take care of selling their house. If the buyer isn't able to sell their house within that time frame, the contract terminates. Buyer gets their earnest money back and seller can put the house back on the market. And that's consistent with both exhibits. And then there is a section of it called a kickout provision. And in the GAR form, it's paragraph D, and it's specifically labeled kickout provision. In the RE form, it doesn't have a paragraph number or letter, and it is called demand to remove contingencies. And basically what this means is a seller can say, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I will take your contract and I will allow it to be contingent upon you using your best efforts to sell your existing home. However, you allow me to continue to market my home as active, and if I get another contract that I want to accept, I give you basically first right of refusal. I can exercise that kickout provision. And what that means, and you negotiate the time frame in a number of hours, and typically we see anywhere from 48 to 72 hours. And if the kickout provision is part of this exhibit, it's not required. Again, that's something that the buyer and the seller negotiate. But if that kickout provision is negotiated as part of this contingency, then the seller says, okay, I have another offer that I want to accept. So you now have, again, 48, 72 hours, whatever the parties negotiate, to let me know, are you able to go through with the contract, or am I going to terminate with you and accept the offer from the next buyer? Now, not only does the kickout provision remove the contingency for the buyer to sell or lease their existing home, but it removes all contingencies in favor of the buyer. So there is no more due diligence provision, no more buyer's right to terminate contingency, no more financing contingency, no more appraisal contingency. So if the parties go under contract, sale or lease contingency exhibit with the kickout provision, and the seller exercises that kickout option, if the buyer wants to go through with it, then the buyer agrees to go through with the sale, no more contingencies whatsoever. So you have two kinds of buyers. You have a buyer that, you know what, I love house B, but there's no way I can't qualify to purchase house B while I still have a mortgage on house A. So if I get kicked out, I'm going to have to terminate and get my earnest money back and wait till I sell or go under contract with another house. Then you have another buyer. Yes, financially, I am qualified to purchase house B and have a mortgage payment on house A. I just don't want to. So just because there is a kickout provision doesn't necessarily mean it's an automatic termination for the buyer. It depends on that buyer's financial situation. The thing, however, that I want to bring to your attention where there has been some confusion is on the buyer side of it. So the kickout provision is exercised by the seller. The seller will, if there is a kickout provision that's agreed upon, it is the seller who has the option of kicking out the buyer. If the buyer, back to the actual contingency itself, it says this agreement is contingent upon the occurrence of the following on or before, and you put a date, and the following is either selling it or leasing it. And that verbiage is similar in both forms. The issue where the confusion sometimes comes in is the buyer cannot terminate the purchase and sale agreement prior to that date. So a buyer can't, let's say you have a date that's, well, whatever the date is. A buyer, this isn't a termination right for a buyer prior to that date. If they change their mind or it's not a due diligence type period. It's not an automatic termination for the buyer prior to that date. The buyer has to stay in contract with the seller based on this contingency through that date. If their house doesn't sell or lease the day after that date, at that point the contract terminates, but it is not a termination right for the buyer prior to that date. So if a buyer terminates prior to the date that's outlined on the sale or lease contingency, and based on this contingency, the buyer will be in default of the contract. So again, I'm not sure why, but there is that sort of confusion on this exhibit. Again, it is not an outright termination rights for the buyer prior to that date. So I hope that helps explain this exhibit. Again, it's sale or lease of buyer's property contingency exhibit. And thank you so much for watching. Again, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.